I read the fifth season by N.K. Jemisin. This is the first book in a trilogy. I'll be talking about all three of them, but I won't be spoiling them as I go, and so I won't talk about the connections between the books until I get to them. However, I will be spoiling this book. And I think these books deserve like an entire podcast dedicated to them, not like episodes of a podcast. So there's so much to say about these books that this will be very superficial, in my opinion. Even though I'm going to try and do the best that I can, I have no idea how long this will be because the point of this project is to be off the top of my head and just kind of like my reaction to the text. But all of that to say, it's inadequate to what these books are in terms of literature. I've read these books before several times, so I'm very familiar with them and I have a lot of thoughts about them. And I would start by talking about that the books, in my opinion, are epic fantasy and that they take advantage of the thing that epic fantasy can do, where you take the internal experience of a character and you externalize that into an entire world that all of the other characters inhabit. And so if we go like a 10,000-foot view of the story in this book, what you basically have is the story of a woman with two children, and one of the children is murdered by her husband, the father, and the other one is kidnapped, and she is in pursuit of her child and of her murderous husband. And that's kind of like the core emotional experience. And an entire world is built out from that core. And so what I mean by that is that, like there's all these magical powers and this intricate world building and all of this history that's built into it and all that stuff to be like, that has nothing to do with a murdered child or a terrible husband, an abusive partner. What I mean is that the logic of the world, the way that the magic system works, all of that stuff is the internal experience of the main character pulled out into the world, made into a world that everyone else inhabits. And so one of the first things that we see is a man using his magical powers from a high plateau, looking down on a city and ripping the entire world apart and using his magic to cause a cataclysm that is going to ruin the world for thousands of years for any kind of life. So he kills millions and millions of people and animals and plants with this act that we have no context for. That's the first thing that we see. So there's an extreme violence happening in the world perpetrated by a man right away in the story. In the same way, over and over again, men who are father figures or who are fathers abuse children in the story. And so there's just a repetition of this kind of archetype of men doing violence to children to the point of even murdering them. And then the main character enduring that trauma, whether she is a child or is supposed to have a child or has had children. In each part of the story, that violence falls into her life and defines a lot of the worst parts of it. And this kind of extreme event of losing a child to murder would fracture the identity of any person, because one moment you were a parent, a mother, a wife, and now all of those things are taken away from you, and your identity has to be radically redefined. And so the way that that's reflected in the narrative, I think, is we get this fracturing of time, but also of narrative voice that happens. And so the most proximate version of the character, Essun, is told to us in a second person voice, which is very unusual. But that second person voice is not necessarily addressing us, the reader, although I think that is part of the narrative effect. Jemisin is doing complex things throughout the book in terms of like manipulating our access to knowledge and our awareness of what is happening. And I think part of what draws us into the story and makes things feel very immediate is that second person voice, but it is extremely unusual. But in any case, there's the second person voice of Essun, and then the present tense is used for the other point of view characters, who are all the same character, of course, but like I said, are fractured in the way that trauma fractures the psyche of people. And so her story is told in a kind of 3-act structure, but those 3 acts exist as if they are different people who are then integrated into one personality by the end of the book in a very like loose way, not in a healthy, coherent way yet. But like I said, you know, just thinking of like the mundane experience of this kind of extreme trauma of losing a child in this way would do immediate harm to your sense of yourself and your sense of your own story. Suddenly, this would become the most important part of any recollection that you would have about any point in your life. It would overwhelm all of the other experiences that you had. Like if you thought back to your own childhood, it would be colored by the fact that your own child is now gone, if you see what I'm saying. And so there's no distance that you could get psychically from that experience. And so it would come to like redefine your experience of yourself. And the only escape from that is to make a hard break in your consciousness and bury the trauma in a way where it vanishes. A kind of personal temporary amnesia around that kind of psychic wound. And so I think that's the way that we experience the story the first time that we read through it. There is an unusual proximity that we have to Essun by having the narrator address us as you when they're addressing Essun herself. And so we feel very close to her. But at the same time, that puts some distance actually between us and her actual story, because it's not Essun herself narrating events to us. There's an intermediary voice that's delivering the information to us. And so it's as if Essun has forgotten her own history, is what I'm saying. And this is exactly what happens in extreme cases of trauma, right? Like you lose your memory around the event. And so as her story is being retold to her, it's being told to us as well. So there is like some distance from it in that way that would be natural for that to happen. And then, like I said, the other points of view in the story are told in the present tense, not in the past tense. And so we have no feeling that these things are necessarily not happening concurrently the first time that we read the book. Because of the tense of the time, we would believe that all of these things are happening immediately, all right at the same time, right? And it's only at the end of the story that we're putting together the pieces and we're seeing, oh, this actually is the youngest version of Esun, and this is the teenager 20-something version of Esun. Okay. And putting all of the pieces together. Perhaps the way that Esun herself is doing as she's listening to her life being narrated back to her. But those two versions of Esun, which are removed from the trauma, don't have that intermediary voice of being addressed directly to the reader in the second person of saying, you did this, you did that. Instead, it's a more familiar third person, but in the present tense. And so I think the effect of that on us as readers is that we end up feeling closer and maybe even safer in the narrative with the child and young adult version of Esun, because we don't understand the trauma that is coming in the future. We just understand her struggles and goals and everything about the rounded character that is her as we are encountering it in the story as we go along. And so without that context, we experience the actual amnesia that comes with PTSD. But it's only because of our ignorance as readers going through in the first time. So this is a very carefully constructed way that the world is being delivered to us as readers, a very carefully controlled version of time being delivered to us. I just find it amazing and masterful. And one of the most remarkable things about the book, just its structure in itself, I think reflects the experience that is at the core of the book, the kind of emotional bedrock that everything else is built on. Because trauma is so complicated and reaches through your experience in such a way that it will touch everything that came before it and everything that comes after it. And so it sits kind of in the middle of things, no matter where the trauma is delivered. Even if something happened to you a very, very long time ago, it continues to kind of exert emotional gravity over everything that you experience going forward, in a way as if it just happened recently. And in the same way, a trauma that happens to you just yesterday can recolor all of your experiences all the way back to your childhood. And so I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I just think the construction itself is extraordinary in this way and kind of reflects what I'm saying about building a world out of an interior experience. We could just, Jemisin could just explain the heartbreaking experience of this the way that she does so masterfully at the beginning of the book and be done with it in a mundane setting that we could all relate to. But by bringing it into this entire world that echoes with that experience over and over and over again, we end up fully inhabiting not just the experience of it itself, but the kind of logic by which this extreme kind of trauma operates. We internalize it deeply, not just as a perspective, but as a way of being. And so to step, off of that 10,000 foot kind of place and actually dig into the plot a little bit here, like I said, you get into things with Esun and her finding her dead child beat to death by her partner in a small town. And we start to learn about, in the aftermath of this extreme earthquake event that is happening somewhere far away, about the magical powers that Esun has at her command, where she can feel the movements of the earth underneath the crust, and she can control those somehow. She has a kind of telekinesis, but for just the elements of the earth, it seems like. And so as the earthquake kind of rips across the landscape and approaches her village, she causes the earthquake to just pass by and the village doesn't feel it at all, even though it rips apart the nearby landscape. I think this is reflective of a certain kind of numbness that happens directly after an event of emotional trauma. And so you just can't feel anything. You can't deal with anything. It doesn't matter how catastrophic the next thing coming into your life is. You'll be like, imagine an extreme accident or something where a loved one dies and they go to the hospital and everything and they don't make it. And then you get the hospital bill. If I don't know if you live in America and you don't have that kind of thing paid for by your government, you get a big hospital bill after the death of your loved one. Well, you don't even feel the kind of burden of that hospital bill yet because you don't have any emotional space for it. And so it's almost as if the huge earthquake that happens, it can't even be dealt with right now. Like that's the end of the world, right? Because the world has already ended for Essun. The death of a child is the end of the world for a parent. And so that's why the setting is apocalyptic. It's post-apocalyptic. And when the apocalypse rolls in, it doesn't affect the town because it's already here, emotionally speaking. Then Essun leaves the town because she's going to track down her husband and get revenge and find her daughter. These are her goals for the rest of the novel. And she very quickly comes across a little boy who operates as a kind of surrogate son for the rest of the book, but also is a kind of echo, an uncanny echo of her own son, and is a strange creature who she doesn't totally understand and who has weird powers that frighten her. And so just as Essun was able to use orogeny, is what it's called in the book, to control the earth underneath her, her little son could do the same thing. And this is why the husband killed him, because this kind of magical ability is despised by regular people. And if they don't report it to the government, then they tend to kill people who have that power. And so you can see the degree to which the people who have orogeny are hated, that he would kill his own son for having it. The regular people are taught to not even see people who have orogeny as being fully human. And so it's as if, his son was a monster and he killed him. Well, now Essun's experience of this kind of surrogate son is that he is a monster. He is a strange creature that she doesn't understand who does weird things. And she's a little bit frightened of him for the whole story. And so he's like a kind of emotional stand-in for her son. Then the voice of the novel changes and we move through time, although we're not aware of it. And like I said, everything is in the present tense. And we get the story of Demaya, who is the childhood version of Essun. And we find out how her powers were first uncovered when she was being bullied at school, and she unconsciously uses her abilities to fight back. And then her parents throw her out of her house. They don't give her clothing. They don't give her enough food. They don't give her a place to use the bathroom. So they treat her as subhuman immediately and report her to the government to be picked up. And then they're resentful about the guardian who comes to get her, named Shafa, reprimanding them for not giving her a coat or enough food and things like that, because they're like, well, she's not even really a person. She's a monster. Why would we take care of her? And so his protectiveness of her, I think, my experience of reading it the first time, even though this was back when it first came out years and years ago, I immediately liked Shafa because it seems like he's protective and taking care of her. He's a kind of surrogate father. He seems like a good father. He's protective of her and cares about her welfare, and her parents don't. And so her parents seem like the monsters, not Demaya. And Shafa seems like a good guy. But this is quickly inverted. And again, we get the idea of a man doing violence to his child. So I think there's a kind of surrogate relationship that is being set up here of Shafa being her surrogate father. We get those fatherly feelings right away. We're drawn into that relationship. And then Shafa betrays the archetype of the father by breaking Demaya's wrist. And he does this in a way to demonstrate to her that she can control herself and not lash out with her powers when she feels pain, and how it's very important for her to be able to control herself because she might unconsciously use her powers in a way that could kill a lot of people, do damage to communities and whatnot. And he's teaching her, he's like, really what he's doing is grooming her to believe that she is a monster, that she needs to be controlled, that she deserves to be punished and in pain, and that she is essentially, at her core, dangerous to the rest of the world. And again, she's been taught about people like her. The vulgar term for people who can use erogyny is ragas. And she's been taught about how ragas are not people, they're monsters. And so she already is starting to have this shame that she's putting onto herself about her own identity, seeing herself as a monster, seeing herself as dangerous and unworthy. And Shafa explains to her that he's going to take her to a place called the Fulcrum, where she will be trained to use her powers correctly, and that she will have a life there if she can pass the tests that are going to be required of her. And so, again, she's not being treated as a human. She's being treated as an object or something that can be used by this institution called the Fulcrum. She's going to be a type of slave, and she's being bred to that and groomed for it immediately as a small child. And so this is why I say that like the abuse of children is just like embedded in the logic of the book. Like this is just like naturally how the world is. Of course, if you have these powers, you will be treated this way. It just makes quote unquote sense within the logic of the story. And you could never do this, I think, if you were telling the story in a mundane way. This would never make sense outside of the context of like a perverse cult or something like that. But because Jemisin is able to build an entire magical world that is separate from our own, you can introduce these kind of logics into it, which draws us deeper into the actual psychic experience of Demaya as a person. We can see how having the ability to cause an earthquake that flattens an entire community because you can't control your emotional and physical response to things that will inevitably happen to you, like going through pain and going through emotional suffering in the form of like teasing. That is a dangerous situation that needs to be controlled for the safety of everyone involved. And so the logic's been constructed in a way where we can accept that maybe this kind of abuse makes sense. But if we take one step back, we can see that it is monstrous and that Shafa is the one who is a monster and not Demaya. There are all kinds of unsettling things about Shafa, and I don't mean to imply that Jemisin is saying, like, here's a way that I think it's okay to abuse kids. That's not what I'm saying. The point is to draw us deeply into the experience of a traumatized and abused person to the point where, like, we expect and it makes sense to us why they are being hurt. We jump into the experience of Cyanite after that. And Cyanite is kind of an A-plus student who has perfected everything about being a fulcrum orologist. And she has been able to achieve a 4th rank in a 10 rank system, and she has been paired up with a 10 ranked urologist who is like the strongest kind in a mentor mentee kind of relationship, and given her first assignment outside of the fulcrum where she's going to clear out some coral from a bay. And so this is the kind of work, I guess, that the fulcrum does. And there's all kinds of things that we get to see in this part about how people with urology are treated by the fulcrum. And they're basically slaves, is what it boils down to. They're unpaid workers who are expected to have sex and produce children no matter how they feel about their partner. And if they don't obey, they will be severely physically punished or killed for their disobedience. And so Cyanite's entire approach to the fulcrum is to be the most obedient, the most rule following. Like, nobody can object to the behavior that Cyanite has, and she knows the answer to every question. She knows every rule, and she follows them all perfectly and without hypocrisy, so that she can get the most favor and most privileges. She can be the most free that the fulcrum will allow her to be. But it doesn't change the fact that she is essentially a slave. Her mentor is named Alabaster, and you can see in the names there, Cyanite, Alabaster. These are not people names. These are objects. They're types of stone. And so even in the naming conventions of the ragas, they are named after objects, and they're treated as instruments of the fulcrum. They're not full people, and that is reflected in the naming conventions, I think. Alabaster is like way more powerful than her. We see over and over again how he's able to do things very easily that to her seem impossible. And while they're traveling along, it's revealed to Cyanite that there are all of these, they're called nodes, in a system that the fulcrum uses to create large areas where there are no earthquakes at all. Because for some reason, the world is like very tectonically active, and there's earthquakes all the time, new volcanoes springing up and things like that. And so the fulcrum uses people who have the ability to wield urology and puts them into these nodes, and they kind of take care of a certain area, and the nodes all touch each other, and this creates like large provinces of stable land for communities to pop up in. And Alabaster reveals that the node network is populated by probably his children. And part of the reason why Cyanite is with him is for her to get pregnant. And again, so you have a father here again, and we find out that these children are being very badly abused. And one of them seems to like go off and is doing the opposite of their job. So instead of stilling the earthquakes, they are causing earthquakes. And so they go to where this node is, and you see this grotesque kind of abuse that is happening with the fulcrum, where they have been fully instrumentalized. They are not treated as a person at all. They're hooked up to this equipment that is kind of feeding them, but also carrying off their waste. So they're just like full of tubes, and they're not allowed to like have a conscious experience of the world. They have no friends or community. They're just like stuck in a chair with a bunch of plumbing coming out of them and using their orogeny skill to stabilize the land around them. And because this one is losing its mind, Alabaster has to kill the child. And so again, we get this repetition of a father killing a child. Even though in this context, it's much sadder, but there's this kind of implied threat or implied trauma that Cyanite is trying to have a baby with Alabaster, and this will probably be the fate of their child. That even if it's not killed, that it will suffer this kind of indignity and torture for its entire life to be instrumentalized by the fulcrum. And so after this incident, the narrative switches back into Essun's perspective and saying, you did this and you did that. And so we have a kind of tritagonist structure that is being laid out for us, where we have 3 protagonists who all have their own goals. Essun is after the murderer of her child. Demaya is trying to survive being taken away from her family and being delivered to the fulcrum, and Cyanite is trying to become a 10 ringer, or at least the most free that she can be within this institution. Essun ends up meeting someone on the road named Tonki, and she is what in the story is called calmless. This means that she doesn't have a community of her own. And with the catastrophe that has happened set off by Alabaster, the world is like way more dangerous for people who are calmless. And so Cyanite joins up with Tonki because they seem to have a really good mechanical ability, but also are good at knowing their directions and like might be handy basically as she's trying to like track this person down and kind of going in the same direction as them anyway. And so like as much as Essun is kind of flinty and hard-hearted, it seems underneath she wants to protect people, she wants to build community, she wants companionship. And Tonki is one of those things that shows that Essun has vulnerability to her. Things switch back to Demaya, the youngest version, and talk about what life is like in the fulcrum, learning how to be an origin. And there is a lot of bullying that goes on between the other students and her. Demaya tries really hard to follow the rules and be a good student. And the other kids are resentful of her, especially because she comes from outside the fulcrum. Many of the children were born inside the fulcrum. Their parents were older origins who were forced to have kids, and they were the result, and they're raised by the guardians. And since Demaya is a little bit exotic because she's from the outside, that means that she sticks out and doesn't fit in. So there is a plot to get her in trouble. We learn that the way that the guardians teach all of the children is through group punishment instead of individual punishment. And so Demaya, her shoes are stolen, and then that means that she fails the morning inspection that they have. They have to wear uniforms. And because she fails the inspection, everyone gets punished. This helps, I think, to take away their individual identity, to identify themselves as origins, and to see themselves as their job first and a person second, if at all, and to harshly police the people around them so that the staff doesn't have to, the guardians don't have to, the teachers don't have to, because the students are policing each other in order to avoid punishment. But it's part of what allows the people on the outside to treat every origin as the same kind of monster and as dangerous creatures rather than individuals who some might be good at their job and others might not be. Every origin is a Schenectady for the group, and that starts inside of their own head. They see other origins as representing themselves, and so they will resentfully police them when they are doing things that are going to hurt themselves as an individual. So like you see another origin do something that you feel like is a threat to you because they are acting out of character, and you stop them from doing that. Even if that person is like just trying to be free, just trying to be a whole person, you would stomp down on that because it's going to get everybody punished. It's going to reflect badly on the community of origins. So this is one of the techniques of keeping an entire group of people down, convincing them that they're worthless, and then getting them to police themselves within the community according to standards that dehumanize them. One of the other things that the fulcrum does when teaching the origins is to give them impossibly high standards and very limited freedoms that are doled out according to rank. And so this is the same kind of logic that's deployed in the real world military, where you don't really have choices about places that you live, the kind of food that you're going to eat, and so on and so forth. But as you rise up in the ranks, you get more access to all of those things that are just in civilian life, kind of a given, and the whole like bare bones of what your life is. Things start with like food and shelter and clothes, but in the military, those are the rewards that are dangled out the furthest reach. In the same way, within the fulcrum, individual liberty, the ability to travel, the kind of accommodations that you can have, the networks of friends that are available to you are all contingent upon achieving a higher rank. And the standards for those ranks are impossibly high in a way that is self-consciously designed. So it's not that they just have really high standards because they care a lot about this kind of thing. They are deliberately making the standards impossible to meet in order to exert a kind of psychic control over the group. And so this is yet another vector where the origins are dehumanized and controlled. Demaya is able to figure out who it is that is stealing her shoes and also poisoning her drink one time with alcohol, getting her drunk, which also got her in trouble. And basically, it's another origin girl who is an outcast because she has a hard time controlling her powers, as well as a boy in the group. And the guardians step in once everything has been proven that Demaya is not at fault, and they end up with those students leaving. And as far as we can tell, they're sent somewhere else. But there's also a heavy implication that maybe they were just killed, because everything is like very brutal around the fulcrum and the origins and the relationship between the origins and the guardians, as we already saw with their hands getting broken, which is something that seems to happen to all of the children as they're being trained. It's a typical lesson that the guardians do to the children. So then we go back to Cyanite, and her and Alabaster arrive at the coastal city where they have to remove a coral reef, and they're treated very poorly by the administrator who is in charge of their project. They were supposed to be greeted by the highest ranking official in the area, but a much lower official greets them, and Alabaster causes a problem around it because he feels like they are not being treated with the due dignity of their rank, while Cyanite feels like they should not rock the boat, so to speak, because they should just follow the rules. Everybody knows that Ragas are not humans. They don't need to be treated with dignity, and on like that. And so she has all of this internalized shame and bad self-image, and Alabaster doesn't have that kind of stuff. He's very resentful of the way that he's treated, like he's not a full person, like he's not a human being. And so he insists that they meet with the actual governor and not this underling, and that they, get really good food and really good place to sleep and all of this stuff. And what happens is their food gets poisoned, or Alabaster's does anyway. And then Cyanite has to do the project by herself without his guidance. And when she does this, she discovers that in the bay, Alabaster doesn't die or anything. He just gets poisoned. And they end up, actually, the way that they save him, using orogeny on his body, which Cyanite felt like was impossible. But Alabaster often does things that seem impossible. And so this is yet another example of that kind of thing. But Cyanite goes to the bay and she figures out that the real problem is they're going to, clear away the coral, but then the coral is going to grow back within, like 100 years or something like that, because there's something in the bay that should not be there that is raising the floor of the water up too high. And she can feel it, but she doesn't know what it is. And she wants them to take a step back from the project and do a study and figure out what's going on. But all of the officials are fed up with Alabaster and Cyanite and just order her to do it anyway, and they don't care. And so she pulls out this object from the bay that is in the story called an obelisk. And these are mysterious objects that don't seem to fully interact with reality in some way, like they phase in and out of existence. And they have seen them throughout the story in the sky, but they're mysterious objects. They have no idea. There's like ancient technology, lost technology in this post-apocalyptic setting that nobody knows what they do, but they don't care because they don't seem to cause problems otherwise. And so they just leave them alone. But this one is not floating in the sky, and it seems to be broken in some way, like it's actually broken open. So Cyanite pulls this thing out of the bay, and then that causes her to somehow link with it. And inside of there is what looks like a person, like a little boy. And so we come back to this theme of a child, a little boy, who he seems to be dead or trapped inside of there. And this is all very surprising to her, but her orogeny links with the monolith somehow, and she is charged up with huge amounts of power. And essentially what ends up happening is she touches off a super volcano underneath the entire community, and the entire place explodes and dies. So it's a little bit like how the beginning of the book starts on a smaller scale. But again, you have this cataclysmic disaster that's tied to a little boy being dead. And so there's that theme to it. I don't want to like overemphasize this or make it sound like I misunderstand the point of the story or like what's going on. Like I understand there's a difference between the symbolic order of things that are happening in the story and the literal actual events of the story, and that those have their own meaning and significance in terms of how they unfold in a linear way across the story. Like I get it. These things are literally happening to Cyanite, and they have an actual material effect on her life diegetically within the story, and that they're not all about symbolism and what things mean, but this is just how I do analysis of stories. And so I tend to take the structures and then like examine those against a kind of symbolic reading of the entire text. And so I don't think that like somebody's son literally died here, and then that when a son dies, then it causes an explosion to happen or something like that. Like I get it. I understand what's happening in the story in a literal way. This is an accident that happens and is tied a little bit to Cyanite's ambition, but also the miseducation that she's been subject to at the Fulcrum, which is a big thing that Alabaster keeps harping on about. how they teach them just enough information, but not the actual truth of what's going on. And if maybe they had learned the truth, things would have shaken out differently for this community. And we find out in the long run anyway that the entire thing seems to be a little bit of a trap, or maybe a convenient way to get rid of Alabaster. Things jump back to Asun, and we find out the surrogate child, Hoa, has been sensing where Asun's husband and daughter have gone, just somewhere to the south, and somehow he's been able to track them with his weird powers. And he says that there's a whole bunch of people all in the same place and that he's not able to track them anymore. But he thinks that they should go to that place wherever it is. And so they manage to track down this place to a town, and the town seems abandoned. But then when they dig deeper, they find out that there's like a secret passage down to a community that is mysterious and underneath the ground, which is something that is especially dangerous in this time of the fifth season, so to speak, this time when it's not summer, spring, winter, or fall, but this season of apocalypse, because during those times, it's more likely that there's going to be lots of earthquakes and stuff, and being underground during an earthquake is a terrible idea. But for whatever reason, there are lots and lots of origins here, and that's what Hoa is sensing. And so Asun wants to find her daughter, and she feels like her daughter is here. And so that's where they're going to go, whether it's a good idea or not. Then it switches back to Demaya and her training in the Fulcrum, and come to find out that she's been exploring all over the place as she gets more freedom. She's been finding all of these rooms that nobody uses, and it seems like the Fulcrum is far more ancient than we might have guessed, and it's full of secret places and laboratories and mysterious locations that hint at a deep history to the world that is characterized by a decline in technology and a decline in knowledge of the technology. And so there's not even story or legend or myth context for Demaya to contextualize these things. And we as readers can kind of figure out what they might be useful for, but she has no context for them. One day, this little girl named Beanoff comes into the Fulcrum and kind of inserts herself into Demaya's class and pretends to be one of the grits, which is what they call the lowest ranked people in the Fulcrum. And she wants to explore, and she implicates Demaya in her goals. She is not orogenic. She's just a normal girl from the outside. And her family is like really, really rich and powerful. And so she is just like self-indulgently working her way into the Fulcrum to satiate her personal curiosity. And so they figure out that there's like a big void to the building that has no door to it based on their sense of like how big the building is and how many rooms they have access to. And Demaya figures out how to gain access to this space, and they go in there, and it triggers one of the guardians to come and try and stop them. And what they see is a huge space for basically like one of the monoliths to plug into. It's called a socket. It's extremely mysterious. Beanoff is very excited about this whole thing, but Demaya is scared. One of the guardians comes to stop them, and coming in contact with the area of the socket seems to do something to her mind. And she seems to be taken over by some other personality and become a different person. And Shafa has to come in there and actually kill the other guardian. It seems like pulls something out of the back of her head, which takes her out of commission. And so it seems like the Guardians are somehow constructed or are objects themselves in some way. And so even though they are the enforcers and the oppressors of the Fulcrum system, they themselves are also instruments in that institution. And so the institution doesn't seem to have like a privileged class that stand outside of its exploitation. But nonetheless, it doesn't change how oppressive and dehumanizing the entire institution is. In any case, the girls get in trouble, and Shaf tells Demaya that she is going to have to take her test immediately, or she is going to be killed the way that the Guardian was just killed. And things leave off, and we go back to Cyanide again, and she ends up waking up on a tropical island, which is bad news in this world because islands can be subject to tsunami waves and are easily wiped out by earthquakes. But the place is full of people, and they seem really excited about Alabaster and Cyanide being there. Now, one thing that's going on here with the structure of the three stories is that they're kind of paralleling each other in interesting ways, I think. So you have Demaya finding a secret chamber, making a friend who is an uneasy ally, who stresses her out, who breaks the rules, who upsets her. And Cyanide has the same kind of relationship with Alabaster, and they find this secret obelisk. Bino and Demaya find the socket, which is related to the obelisk, and Essun finds the secret calm that's underground in a way that seems very unwise, but is also full of orogenic practitioners. So, and then also Essun has the companion of Hoa, who kind of makes her uneasy. And so you can see that there's a lot of parallel relationships, parallel structure to the story. They're kind of echoing each other. And it gives the story a nice rhythm. It makes it feel interconnected, but in a way that is fairly subtle and doesn't like hit you over the head because they're not like finding the same places. They don't have the same goals. These things are not happening for the same reasons, but structurally they're very, very similar and interconnected. So anyway, Cyanide finds out that the reason they're on this island is because Alabaster saved them. And the way that he was able to do that was with a stone eater that he is friends with named Antimony. The stone eaters are able to go through the earth the way that we can swim through water is how things are described. And this is just like, in terms of world building, all of this stuff is really impressive to me. It's so cool and original and different. And so instead of making up a fantasy world that's full of orcs and dwarves and elves and vampires and werewolves and whatnot, Jemisin is giving us something where people have these earthbound powers that I haven't really talked about the magic system yet, but there's the floating obelisks and the post-apocalyptic setting and these stone eater creatures who are really weird and different and very original. So like the world feels like something new, something totally different in the fantasy genre to me. It's not borrowing a lot of tropes or ideas from the larger well of fantasy creations. And so we're not seeing like, gorgons and centaurs or other mythological creatures from different ancient civilizations showing up, dragons and things like that. Nothing against all that stuff. I love that stuff. I read a lot of that stuff. But this just feels like on a different level of creativity. It feels like she didn't want to settle for that stuff. And in crafting her own world in this way, again, I think it gives her access to creating a world that is highly specific to these characters and speaks to their interiority in a very rich, symbolic way, like I keep harping on over and over again. So somehow antimony got them here, and then antimony takes off, and we don't really see her, I think, kind of for the rest of the story pretty much. And they meet the leader of the island when some ships come back from the ocean. This guy's name is Imam or Inan. I'm sorry, Inan. He's not the leader of a Muslim group. His name is Inan. And he's a very charismatic guy. He also has orogenic powers, but he's untrained in terms of the fulcrum style of learning about his powers. He's just like learned what he can on his own and from other people, what Cyanite calls a feral, someone who was never brought into the fold. But part of the reason why these people are able to live on the island despite the dangers is because there are people with orogenic powers on the island, and they're able to protect it, just like Essun protected her village at the beginning of the story from the huge earthquake. So they're able to make the tsunamis go around them and calm earthquakes and things like that. And what they do is they go out and they're pirates. They find ships that are on the ocean and they raid them for supplies and food and then bring them back home. And people can't really follow them because the oceans are too dangerous, especially with all the earthquakes and tsunamis and stuff. And so it's not worth trying. And nobody ever comes looking for them because everybody knows it's too dangerous to live on an island. And so this brings into focus something that I think Jemisin's been doing for the entire story, and that is offering up kind of picture of utopia. A utopia as an idea, originally comes from a book that describes an island. This place is an island. And there's something idealized about this part of the book. For the first time ever in the story, Cyanite starts to allow herself to feel pleasure, to feel attachment. They have escaped the Fulcrum's surveillance and control because presumably they died in the supervolcano that took the town that they were supposed to clear out the coral from. And so as far as the Fulcrum is concerned, they died. And so as long as they stay on this island and build a new life for themselves, that's kind of like the end of the story in a way. These people live in a very mutual aid, communal style economy. They don't really deal with money very much. They enjoy things like jewelry and fine clothes, but they share amongst themselves and don't worry about money because the population is so small that people are just helping each other out. They subsist mostly on fish and seaweed and things like that. They can't really grow food on the island, but they don't need to grow food so much, and they can get whatever else that they want from the pirate raids. And so they sit outside the hierarchy of control. There doesn't seem to be a lot of petty politics among the people on the island. Inan is a generous, caring, and charismatic guy who everybody on the island seems to love him. He immediately forms an attachment with Alabaster and Cyanite, and the three of them become lovers together. And despite the fact that Alabaster and Cyanite have been having sex in order to try and create a baby for the Fulcrum this whole time, that sex was joyless and approached with a sense of bitterness and resentment on both of their parts. And we find out in this part that part of the reason for that is because Alabaster prefers men. And so there was no chance that he was ever going to enjoy it anyway. And Cyanite just doesn't have chemistry with Alabaster in that way. But the three of them together, for whatever reason, really seem to work well romantically. And so, like I said, this part of the book is idealized. They eat good food. They have a good community. And it turns out that Cyanite did catch pregnant before they got to the island. And she ends up having a baby boy that is her and alabasters. And the baby is extremely powerful orogenically. He starts quelling quakes from the time that he's still like a little crawling baby. Like before he's a toddler, he's already doing stuff orogenically. But despite how idealized the island is, Cyanite feels restless and wants to get away from being a mother and being on the island, and wants to like try out doing the pirate raids and stuff. And so no matter how good it is, it seems like Cyanite can't settle into the rhythm of it. And the reason that I bring up Utopia and that Jemisin is kind of doing something, I don't think that this only exists in the story as a contrast to all of the other like horrible things that have been happening in the story, and offers us a bit of relief and a bit of, like I said, contrast to the rest of the story, which it does do that. But I think that you can look back at things, and at least this is how it works for me, that once I notice like, oh, this is a kind of utopia, I look backwards at the other communities that we've seen throughout the book and can recognize other utopian type tones, and then how those end up being subverted throughout the story. And so, for example, Demaya going to the fulcrum originally was a relief. The idea of it was a good thing compared to being with her parents, who were mistreating her and neglecting her and just outright abusing her, honestly. And it seemed like the fulcrum was going to be an answer to that situation, but at the end of the day is full of control and grooming. And even though she's not surveilled when she's in the building, like she's allowed to go around and explore to all these different nooks and crannies, but the reason that she's allowed to do that is because she's self-policing, and because the other Raga are going to police her behavior as well. And so it's more of a dystopia than a utopia in that place. And it's similar with the opening village, I think, that Essun had this kind of ideal life where she had 2 kids and a husband, and everything seemed like it was working okay, and she was safe. No one knew her secret about being a Raga. And then all of it comes crashing down. The community turns on her. Even though she saves them, they hate her, and they blame her for all of the bad things that are happening to them. In addition to, losing her family through this incredibly violent trauma. But in a sense, like if you zoom all the way out of the story, the entire world is this kind of dystopian, broken nightmare of control, in terms of like the nodes that are populated by these people who have been turned into objects and whatnot. Like that makes the world safer for everybody else, but at an incredibly high sacrifice of the humanity of these people, and then the enslavement of the origins and the dehumanization that has to happen in order to preserve the idea of the slavery, in addition to turning the guardians into objects as well, right? So all of that is very dystopian in its character. And so at the very beginning of the story, to have this cataclysmic earthquake event that destroys the world essentially is actually a kind of relief, because it puts an end to this dystopian system. And as much as it's going to throw the world into a kind of chaos and possibly lead to the extinction of the human race, which is about as bad as it gets, it requires that the entire system change. And it destroyed the fulcrum at its root and destroyed the empire at its capital. And so all of this dystopian kind of thing is overturned, which leaves a space for a utopia to emerge. And so I think that this kind of dystopian, utopian thing is a theme that pulls through the entire trilogy, but I think sits really prominently in this book, especially in this part of the book when cyanite and certainly alabaster are at their happiest and safest. So anyway, cyanite goes off on a pirate mission with Inon, and they successfully raid a couple of ships, but cyanite reveals herself that she is an Origin in the way that she uses her powers to try and get the ships into a position where they can attack them. And so Inon feels that they need to kill everybody on those ships so that their secret doesn't get out and the Fulcrum come hunt them down. And so Cyanite does that despite feeling guilty about having to kill all the people. And then she asks if she can go see the port town that she tried to help but ended up destroying. And Inon indulges her and they go nearby. And then she sees that the supervolcano is still active, which she feels very resentful of and offended by. Like, why haven't the Fulcrum fixed this problem? It's going to cause serious problems for the entire region. And so, like, what is, that's their whole job. Why are they not fixing it? And so she reaches into the volcano and she fixes it. And in doing so, she reveals herself to a guardian who is staying watch there, hoping that her or Alabaster would come back to the scene of the crime. And in a way, her doing this and feeling resentful towards the Fulcrum for not doing their job is her working according to her grooming or her programming through the Fulcrum's education, right? Like, she did the thing that she was programmed to do. And in following the program, that is what caught her out. And so she's not able to escape from this system that she relied on to fulfill her ambitions and try to make herself comfortable within Imperial control. And because she went back to that, it subverts her chance to retain Utopia, because this leads the Fulcrum to the island ultimately. Then we find out that Demaya takes the test and she successfully passes. And when you take the test, then you get renamed, and the name that she picks is Cyanite. And so this tells us, that these two different characters are actually the same character. And this naming convention of having, like, she goes from having a kind of human name to an object name and then back to the name of a human name of Essun. So she moves back into being a full person, represents a kind of journey, I think, that she makes throughout the book, but is a fractured and disjointed journey because it takes the entire book for us to understand that is what happened and that these are not three separate women of different ages. But in a sense, they are, right? Like, they are three different people. That's why they have three different names. But she is kind of composed of these three different layers, if you will. If you think of a stratified rock, that is kind of how her character is composed, of these three discrete layers, but they're all unified into one stone, if you will. And so then Essun goes down into the underground city. They find out that it's a huge geode and not just like a big cave, which seems even more dangerous. According to Tonki, a geode is very unstable if it's been pierced, but something has been done to it to make it super strong. And then the inside of the geode, I mean, it's like a massive, massive, huge geode that's bigger than a whole city. And then they've rigged it up where they have like bridges and ladders and houses and all kinds of stuff built on the inside of it. So it's like a super cool fantasy setting, underground setting, but it's like full of these crystals, and then the crystals glow. And like I said, a lot of people down here are Origins. Whether they're trained or untrained, they have this ability and they've been drawn to the place. Also, another thing about names and objectification that just like popped into my head is this naming convention that happens out in the empire, and the way that people name themselves is according to their use caste. And so this is like a caste system where the people who are in charge end their name, like their last name is leadership. And then it goes all the way down to people who are called strongbacks, who just do the manual labor. And they're kind of at the bottom of the caste system, if you will. And then there's a bunch of intermediate things that are people like doctors and stone knappers and all different kinds of technical jobs that are useful to the comm. And I think that this kind of objectifies people in a way. It boils people down to their teleological value to the community. Instead of being people, you look at them in terms of like, well, what are you contributing to the community? Are you not contributing enough? Then we're going to eject you from the community when times get hard. And we're going to look for other people to bring into the community who can contribute more. And when you compare that to the island community that Inon is running, like nobody has that last name configuration in their community. And Inon himself, of course, is a Raga, technically, right? He's like one of these untrained people. And so he would never be in the leadership caste, if you will. But he has this big, strong body, and he does physical work like a strong back. And at the same time, he is leading the community when he's on shore, but he's the captain of the pirate ships when he's at sea. And so he has many different roles in the community, and there would not be room for that in the caste system that the Empire uses, where it boils people down to one specific specialized role. And the community needs to kind of balance itself in terms of having enough of this kind of person, but not too many of that kind of person. And so in this geode community of Castrima, they have a mixture of these two different ways of being. They have a lot of people who have orogenic powers, and they're using their use case name, their caste name. They're calling themselves Raga. And it's kind of like reclaiming this word that is used as a vulgar slur against characters who have orogenic powers, to say like, no, that is our use in the community. That is the thing that we can do that no one else can do. But at the same time, it is a kind of hybrid version of the imperial system, right? Like, it still boils people down to what do they contribute to the society, and treats people in a very teleological way. Which, speaking of that, the leader of the community of Castrima introduces herself and reveals that she has drawn Essun to the community by using some kind of orogenic trick, because she is also a feral, untrained origin. And so whatever trick that she's using makes other origins come to her, whether they want to or not. Like, it feels like their own idea, but they're like drawn to her, kind of like a lodestone to iron kind of situation is how I think of it. And then she reveals that there is somebody there who's been waiting for Essun, named Alabaster, who wants to talk to her. And so this, like, in a formal way, like, ties all of the different things together, because then there's no denying that Cyanite is Essun, is Demaya. They're all one character with a shared history. And so we jump back to the island at this point, and the little baby is growing up bigger, and Cyanite has her doubts about their ability to stay in this community and train the child. Alabaster's not too worried about it. But then the whole thing is interrupted by an attack coming, because the Guardians have closed in on their location following Cyanite's trail from fixing the super volcano. And the attack that happens it ends up that Alabaster has to call the power of an obelisk again. And we find out that like the way the magical system works, which I haven't talked about at all, which is crazy, is it works according to like a conservation of energy kind of situation where the origin has to find a source of energy, which is usually, if it's an earthquake situation, it would just be the earthquake itself, and then redirect the energy in a way that would like nullify the earthquake. And so if the earthquake is a wave, then you would just make a wave of the same amplitude and form that has a peak where there's a trough and a trough where there's a peak of the motion of the earthquake, and this would cancel out the wave in the plate tectonics. And you would just draw the energy from the earthquake itself. In the absence of an earthquake, they could like reach down into the mantle if they are powerful enough and just draw heat from the earth. But what this does is cause an area around them that has equal and opposite reaction, right? So that they're drawing all of this heat and energy, but at the same time, it's creating this zone of extreme cold and entropy. And so the whole thing, like all of those, like that whole description is pretty scientific. And it falls in line with a trend in fantasy that started happening in the 1980s called science fantasy, or some people call it hard fantasy, kind of the same way that you would have hard science fiction that relies heavily on mathematics and things like that. And this is like a kind of alternate physics that's happening. And it lends itself to a lot of drama in the story because there's clear limits to what can be done. There's costs associated with using the magical power. And that means that every situation cannot necessarily be solved by magic. And then there's all kinds of other secondary rules that have to do with the guardians can nullify things. They can nullify the Origin's ability to use magic, and on like that. But I think in addition to all that, there's also a symbolic layer because Jemisin is so talented and thoughtful in her system, where we are enclosed in this kind of scientific system in the first book for the description of how orogeny works, and having this whole thing of the conservation of energy. And so the bigger the amount of energy you're pulling on, then the bigger the torus that is going to have the zone of cold and entropy. There's a fatal kind of logic to the whole thing that those limits are themselves an enclosed system that the ragas are trapped by, and that it's part of what makes them so dangerous to everyone else because they might flash freeze everyone around them when they're just trying to stop an earthquake or something like that. So I think, like, I guess what I'm saying is there's magic in the world, but it's bound in a very hard way by these scientific rules that enclose the system of magic in a way that feels resonant to me, to the way that the characters themselves who can use the magic are enclosed in a system that exploits them and limits them as human beings. It treats them in inhumane ways. Because usually in a story, you would have these very powerful wizard type characters who have access to magic, and they sit at the top of the hierarchy of power in the world. But that's not the case. These people are at the lowest area of hierarchy in the power structure. And so things are inverted in a way that, like, while this magical system is a really excellent example of the trend in fantasy over the last 40 years or whatever, it's like a superb evolution of that entire narrative trend in fantasy. It is also doing the double duty, I think, of illustrating once again the kind of enclosure that Essun feels within the system. She can't always solve her problems with magic. despite being an incredibly powerful magic user, the system itself limits what she's able to do. And so in this attack, she would have to find a source of heat and energy to stave off what's happening. And there is nothing conveniently placed nearby that would allow her to do that. However, Alabaster has access to one of the obelisks, and this seems to be what the obelisk can do for an origin, is be a free center of energy that doesn't have the kind of backlash effect of creating the huge torus or creating lots of entropy in the system. So, like if you drew a whole bunch of energy from the magma under the earth, right, that would cool off all that magma and displace that heat somewhere else. This sidesteps all of that and allows Alabaster to just draw enormous amounts of power from the obelisk itself, kind of like a battery, and then transmit that power at whatever target he wants. And so he's able to cripple a couple of the ships. I think there's 3 of them. Maybe there's 4. I can't totally remember. And take them out. But some of them have cannons and they're shooting back, and they've got catapults and stuff. And the battle goes back and forth, and Alabaster is using the obelisk more and more, but things are getting pretty desperate. And Cyanite goes to try and help him or figure out what's going on. And it seems that Alabaster is melting into the rock somehow, like he's being drawn down into the rock by antimony, the same way that they originally got to the island. Antimony is kind of forcing him to leave, or maybe it's a consequence of using the obelisk. It's not totally clear if there is a cost to using it, and maybe this is associated with that. But he begs her to protect their son and to not allow their son to be taken to the fulcrum and raised by the fulcrum the way that both of them were. And she promises, and he falls into the stone or whatever. Like, it's weird, but he's drawn into the stone and he's gone. And then Cyanite herself hooks up with a obelisk and just destroys the ships, which have the Guardians on them, and it has Shafa on one of the ships, and she destroys Shafa, and it seems like she gets free of him. But before that happens, Inon is killed by one of the Guardians, and she actually, now I'm remembering this. Shafa shows up and is actually going to take the child away from her. It's so upsetting that I literally like kind of blocked it out of my mind in exactly the way that I'm talking about in the story. He comes to take the child from her, and he's like proud of her for bringing a child into the world with her and Alabaster. Like, you did your job. Good job, girl. You're my favorite girl. It's so disturbing. And instead of allowing their son to be taken by the fulcrum, Cyanite smothers the baby and kills him. And so this is like the repetition of the theme that's been happening the whole book that I keep harping on, that now she is the killer of the child. And you find out that in Essun's backstory, her great shame is that she killed her child. And it's after this moment of killing her child in her grief and anger that she connects with the obelisk, and then she destroys the ship and then like blows everything up essentially by herself. And so she loses her baby to her fear and her certainty about what his life would be like if Shafa kidnapped him, if he got his hands on him. And so she kills Shafa, she kills the other Guardians, she destroys the ships, but she also kills most of the islanders, and she kind of like destroys Utopia, like I was saying. And so like Utopia cannot stand in this world. There's always something blowing it up. change is always happening, and utopia is a kind of static state, and the change always makes it go away. And so now we have this terrible secret of Essun's backstory that links up with the end of the story, that she knows that Alabaster's here and she needs to go meet him. And she realizes also, after we've seen the Stone Eater, that Hoa is obviously a Stone Eater. He's not a human boy. This weirdness that's around him has to do with this secret. And so she needs to confront him about that. And in talking to Alabaster, and they catch up, and he confronts her like, "You killed my son. I hate you." But that doesn't matter right now because of this other thing that's happening. And Essun realizes that Alabaster is the one who has caused the cataclysm that's going to end the world. And he says that they needed to do it in order to accomplish his plan. And so it's not just a random striking back out of grief and anger at the system. It's not just a breaking of dystopia. There's a larger structure that Alabaster is trying to accomplish, but it's left mysterious and hanging at the end of the story. And he asks Essun if she's ever heard of the moon, which, kind of alludes to an idea that I haven't really talked about in the book, but they call the Earth itself Father Earth, which is a gender inversion of how the Earth is typically described when it's gendered, right? Like usually it's Mother Earth because we put seeds into the ground and then those seeds grow up in the same kind of way that, like a father would inseminate a mother. But because the book is structured around this idea of masculine violence to children, the violence of the earth against the kind of children of the earth, if you will, who are humanity, fits in with that schema. And there's a story that we hear earlier in the book that tells us about the Father Earth, the reason that he hates humans and especially hates Origins is because they took away his only child. And so the grief and trauma of the earth itself has something to do with losing its child, which is Essun's story. It's the story at the core of this first novel. And so the implication here at the end of the book is that the moon is the lost child of the earth, and that Alabaster has some kind of plan maybe to retrieve the moon. And so that is the hook that's thrown out there for us to read the next novel. And so I'm making this big claim that this entire book is about, the trauma of losing a child and the way that fractures your identity and building out an entire world from that traumatic event. And yet in this entire thing, I haven't mentioned at all anything about skin color, race, or the organization of the world in terms of like the exploitation of humans and how that relates to an allegory that you could read of American society, the disenfranchisement of Black people. And so I think there's an argument that is made that the entire book is a kind of allegorical arrangement, a symbolic arrangement, like I'm saying, about this loss of a child to the Black experience in America, that there's a deep trauma at the core of the Black experience, and that this world is a built-out world of that internal experience and the logic of that experience being expressed into the logic of the way that origins are treated, the way that they're exploited, the way that they're instrumentalized, the way that they see themselves and police themselves. And the fact that the origins and many of the main characters are very dark-skinned, and that the Guardians are described as having paper white skin, their eye color is white, They have bone white hair, and hair textures and kind of racial features are an extremely important part of the book in identifying the identity of various characters. Like, Essun's always on the watch throughout the story for the various hair textures and the way that she feels about her own hair and how the color of everybody's skin, all of that stuff is really important in the Empire's culture. Who is beautiful, who is not beautiful. And so I think that that reading is not only valid, but I think it's obviously there in the story, and that it is built up alongside this other thing that I've been putting the focus of this podcast on. And I only do that because I think this other experience of the Black experience being in America, being a core symbolic mode for the book, is an interpretation that I've heard from a lot of people. And so while I think it's totally there, and it's a structure that branches across the entire trilogy, so I think it's even more deeply a core part of the story writ large than this initial trauma that mainly plays a part in this first book. I don't really hear people talk about this idea in the first book, which seems really strongly evident and is part of what makes this book work as well as it does, I think. And so Jemisin is doing both things simultaneously and building them together. And she's utilizing that advantage that I talked about that fantasy affords the writer to reach into the interior emotional experience of the character and express that as an entire world that we inhabit the rules and logic of, to the point where we're like, oh, of course people treat other people this way. It makes sense in these terms, but it would never make sense, and it's monstrous if you step back and look at it, in terms of like in the everyday mundane world, right? Except that when it comes to this kind of treatment of people, it is happening every day in America, and maybe more and more in America of 2026 these days, of mistreating people because of the color of their skin, or not even because of the color of their skin, because the people who are mistreating them are racists and then claiming that they are compelled to do it because of the color of their skin. In exactly the same way as saying, like, well, the origins are dangerous, and therefore I have no choice but to beat my child to death, or to drown a baby, or to break their hands and teach them how to control themselves. Children are dangerous, obviously. Origins are dangerous, obviously. The same logic is applied in our culture, where they're like, criminal Black people are dangerous, obviously. People with Black skin are more likely to be criminals, obviously. These are lies that are more obvious to spot after you contemplate the symbolism of the book. And while I think that this symbolism stands out more readily to a lot of readers, and a lot of people are coming to the book for this kind of symbolic experience, I think there's this other important experience that has to do with parenthood, that has to do with the relationships between parents and children, between the experience of being a child and being in an adult supremacist society, a society that sees children as intrinsically dangerous. All of that energy is also in the book in a really important way that I felt like was worth underlining and talking about. But I don't want to de-emphasize this larger symbolic experience that Jemisin is able to capture and invest into her world, that has to do with race and with a personal awareness and shame around race and a policing of race. a measuring of beauty according to the standards of the empire and an internalization of what is valuable as a human being, or internalizing even the idea that you are subhuman because the wider imperial culture says that you're not a full human being for whatever reason, like if you're making an equivalence between the origins and people of color. None of that is true. And when Cyanite goes to Inan's island and experiences pleasure and experiences an equitable romantic relationship with somebody and experiences a community that is based on mutual aid and equality, and where they don't fear her for her powers, for being an origin, people don't mistreat her. It shows that there's a disruption to this logic, right? There's a world in which we can imagine that people can be equal and happy and prosperous, that sits outside of this imperial order that is being enforced by the Guardians. And while it doesn't last long in the story, I think it's very powerful, and that it offers a hope for whatever Alabaster's plan is building towards in the next book. And so I'll be reading the follow-up in the next podcast and continue trying to capture anything about this incredible trilogy. Even though this podcast is really long, I feel like I basically left out a million things and did a discredit to how deep and incredibly well written this first book is. But like I said, this is just like the stuff off the top of my head that I could think to cram into this very long podcast. So